Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Welcome to our Health Equity Roundtable about access and acceptance of the COVID-19 vaccines. The COVID-19 pandemic has really increased awareness of longstanding health inequities, so I'm thrilled to be able to host this roundtable to discuss these issues and the COVID-19 vaccine. Today's event is a PPIL event. The PPIL is a co-curricular program aimed at equipping CBS students with the essential skills and strategies necessary to lead in an inclusive and ethical manner across industries. Today's program will discuss addressing systematic inequity. So for full-time MBA students who want to get PPIL credit, Bianca will put in the chat a link to self-check-in. If you're in the classroom, there is a QR code that you can and then submit your post-event reflection on the campus group site. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests. So Julia Airsore is a dual degree recipient from Columbia University. She received her MD and MBA from Columbia. She received her BS from Yale University. In 2020, Dr. Airsore was named the inaugural executive director of the Dalio Center for Health Justice at New York Presbyterian. In this role, she leads the center's efforts to address longstanding health disparities due to race, socioeconomic differences, limited access to care, and other complex factors that impact the well-being of our communities disproportionately. She's also a board-certified internal medicine in internal medicine and continues to see patients at Columbia University Medical Center. Our second speaker is Zainab Tufekci, who is an associate professor at the School of Information and Library Science at UNC, a visiting professor at Columbia's School of Journalism, and an opinion writer at the New York Times. She is currently working on a book about the social impacts of artificial intelligence and digital connectivity on society, with a special emphasis on machine learning and data. She started her career as a computer programmer before switching to social science to explore the interactions between technology and society. Her work focuses on the social implications of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, big data, and also with societal challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will spend about 40 minutes discussing various topics around health equity and COVID-19 vaccines, and then we'll open it up to questions to the audience. Feel free to put in the chat box, or if you're in person, raise your hand. So thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for being here. So I'd like to just start off the discussion.
I turned my mic on, but
Maybe we're too close to each other.
no idea. But anyway, I will figure it out when I need to speak.
Okay. So I just want to start in thinking about the definition of health inequity, and particularly with how it pertains to the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'd like for both of you to speak about what vaccine equity means to you, both from a US perspective, but also globally. And maybe we'll start with you, Zainab.
All right, let me try again. I think this is not echo. All right, so there's clearly a lot of attention on vaccine uptake as part of vaccine equity because of the pandemic. But to me, the more important sort of question is the whole life cycle of trust in the medical system, not just sort of at that last minute, because we see a lot of inequities at the last minute. And then we tend to focus on the individual decision to accept or not accept, or to go and get it or not get it, rather than looking at the whole cycle of like, what has the medical system and the interaction with the medical system has provided for that person until that moment, to try to understand the sort of the equitable distribution. Now, in the US context, just any interaction with the medical system can be highly stressful, even for a person with proper insurance. And it's just a very complicated, difficult, surprising. We constantly hear stories of, I was insured, I went to the emergency room, got 2 stitches, and 2 months later, I got a huge weird bill and things like that. So that kind of life cycle of the interaction with the medical system, to me, is core to inequity. We see this now with the vaccine uptake in some poorer countries where we're also seeing hesitancy. But if you look at the history of those poorer countries, the medical system has not been a sensible, equitable, fair, globally speaking, part of these people's lives, and they don't really know what to trust and what not to trust. So for me, vaccine equity is a big sort of question that should be viewed in the context of inequities in the whole medical system and the life cycle of that inequity from the, just not just at the moment of the vaccine, do you take it or do you not take it kind of question. And that's kind of, I would like that to be like my contribution to obviously a much bigger debate.
So I definitely agree that the conversation can't necessarily be limited to vaccine equity.
We just need to turn off.
We just turn it off when we're not talking, I guess.
I think, yeah, perhaps. So I think, I think to even begin, I like to start with a definition. So how do we even define equity? The simple definition by many is that equity is the ability for everyone to obtain their optimal health. And when we try to sort of unpack what does that even mean, I think it underscores the comment that you made as well, that people have different access to our healthcare system, but more importantly, they also have differential access to other systems. So the educational system, the financial system, et cetera, the social determinants of health. And these are what impact someone's ability to obtain their optimal health. So it's beyond the scope of just healthcare. And all of that is part of equity. So then when we start to think about vaccines and vaccine equity, it's not just the distribution of vaccines. It 100% is that history that someone has had with our healthcare system, with our system in general. And then additionally, as I'm sure we'll talk about in the future, is global vaccine equity. And how do we start to think about and kind of unpack what should the United States' role be in global vaccine equity? What should all countries' role be in global vaccine equity? But I completely agree that you can't limit it to just the point at which you're putting a vaccine in someone's arm. At that, there's so many steps that precede that, that really underscore trust in the healthcare system, but then also just the system itself. What is someone's access to healthcare? What is their access to the vaccine? So, I think it's actually a relatively complicated question. And I would just underscore that it can't really just be limited to the distribution of the vaccine.
Right, I think maybe building on that, Julia, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how big you view the problem and particularly what communities are being impacted most, because I know the work that you're doing is getting into those communities and trying to address this.
So I think if we take it sort of in our microcosm and then slowly peel outwards, it might be easier. Because there's issues of equity. And for this conversation, I'll kind of limit it to equitable distribution, just so that we can peel off one piece of it and maybe talk about that. So when we first started distributing vaccine in the US, I think the first doses were in December 2020. I was vaccinated in December 2020 with physicians at the time, and there was a mad rush of physician groups to be vaccinated. And after that, there was a little bit of a lull because we started to find that we had to kind of build not only the system to distribute the vaccine, but then build trust with patients. And we had to start thinking about vaccine distribution equity slightly differently. And the reason I make that point is I'm going to bring that back when we start to think about what's happening in the continent of Africa right now, because I think people forget that in the United States, we had and still have an issue of people who didn't really understand what were these newer vaccines. And even though sometimes they were available, weren't sure that they wanted them just yet. So when we first started distributing vaccine though, we had to be very conscious of who were we trying to target. So my experience is with the Armory, which was a vaccination center in 168th Street in our Uptown campus. And it's interesting because I was behind the scenes doing a lot of the work from the beginning with our teams. And we got a lot of negative press for the first couple of weeks that things rolled out. And I don't think people really understood the complexity of the problem. So our goal from the beginning was to make sure that we were targeting the community that we lived in. We wanted to make sure that we had 60% or more of the vaccines going to the 5 surrounding zip codes of 168th Street. And we had to be extremely intentional. But sometimes when you think about vaccine distribution, I just had this conversation the other day, sometimes the easiest thing is not always the right thing. So people started online signups for vaccines. And even though in the background, we were trying to work with our community-based organizations to get people signed up for vaccines, people were just like, our websites were crashing every day with people signing up and putting themselves in to be vaccinated. And at the other end of it is that we weren't able to limit who we were vaccinating at the time. There wasn't a law yet. There wasn't a ruling to say that we could only limit to New York City. We had to be available to New York State. And so because there was online signups and we were open to all of New York State, yeah, we had some issues in the very first weeks with people coming in and being vaccinated that were not from the surrounding community. And so then it was a partnership between local government and also leveraging the community resources and community ties and using our community-based organizations and our connections to get into the community. We then limited only to New York City, which we were able to do because of Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio. And then we additionally had to be extremely intentional about what we were doing to ensure equity. And so I think the point is that this is exactly what we have to do, not only on a local scale, but on a national scale, on a global scale. It's not enough to say that you want to be equitable in the distribution of your vaccines. It's not enough to say that your goal is equity. You have to be extremely intentional in how you achieve it. So we had to set up, we went back and said, online signups are not going to work for all of the patients we're trying to reach. We had to just set up a telephone bank. We hired people to come in and we called patients and set them up for vaccines. We leveraged our community-based organizations and gave them open time slots to bring patients in. We allowed people to bring in their families and their neighbors and just to bring in your community members to be vaccinated. So I think when you think about equity, vaccine equity or whatever equity, you have to be extremely intentional in how you establish the system so that the system doesn't inadvertently push out the people that you're intending to serve. And so I think with our example, it was that one, it took us a little bit of time to figure out how to actually, get to the people we wanted to serve. But then it had to be a partnership, not only with our healthcare system, but with our city and local government, because we had to be able to say, we're limiting to New York City residents only. And I think when we start to look at what's happening now with global vaccine equity, we're seeing similar things where people that had the ability to sign up for online, in this case, it's the wealthier countries that had the ability to buy up all of the vaccine supply, their populace is vaccinated for the most part, or they have the availability to be vaccinated. We see countries in Africa that have zero vaccine, zero. Not a single person has been vaccinated. We see multiple countries where zero have been vaccinated. And so I think you have to say, well, what's the system designed for? Because that's the outcome you're going to get. And unfortunately, in this case, the system is designed to support countries that have the money to pay for the vaccines. And they're trying to fix it now, which we'll talk about. But the outcome is we designed this system to produce this outcome. The one thing I will kind of harp on a lot when we think about pandemics is there is no nationalism in a pandemic. We've suddenly politicized the pandemic. We've thought about, we have to close our borders, close ranks. We think about things on a city level, on a statewide level, on a country level. And that is the absolute antithesis of what we need to be doing. Because this is not, COVID-19 is not just in New York City. It's not just a virus of over there. It is a global pandemic. So unless we start thinking about a system that addresses a global pandemic, we will continue to have a system that fails.
Thanks, Zainab. I know that you've been thinking a lot about the connectivity. So building off of what Julie was saying, and I think on top of mind for everybody is really, Omicron is on everybody's mind right now. And so I would love to hear your thoughts more about the network of the entire world and how the inequity and the current situation has come about.
Trying. Okay, so my actual interest in pandemics as sort of a topic was to try to teach globalization. Because in sociology, if you teach introduction to sociology, which I taught a lot of because I was like the junior person, the textbooks come in a very standard format. First, the sociological imagination, chapter 2, culture. I'm not kidding. Chapter 3, race. Chapter 4, gender. Chapter 5, class. It like literally goes like that. And usually you get these first-year students, you're talking big ideas, race, gender, class, everybody's kind of very engaged. And then we come to chapter 6 or 7, depending on the textbook, globalization, and everybody's like falling asleep. I was like, wait, this is like really important. And they'd be that's where I would lose the class. So I started teaching right long before this pandemic about the sociology of pandemics to try to explain to them this was like the most important thing. Like, it's not like race, gender, class aren't important, but whatever's going to play out is going to play out in the sort of this whole global context. And I would use sort of the SARS and 1918 Spanish flu to try to explain concepts about globalization. And I would say, how many of you know about the 1918 Spanish flu, which it's called the Spanish flu. It's not the Spanish flu. That's part of exactly what we are talking about with all the borders and what we think is the cause and is not, and they didn't even know. So like there is nothing more global than a pandemic almost by definition. And my case to them was like, you have to care about disease surveillance networks in Mexico, in Vietnam, in Kansas, where quite likely the 1918 pandemic might have started there. So like this is just, there's nothing more, especially in a world with travel and where people are flying and globalization and all of that. So yeah, fast forward to this current moment. What the one part of the problem with the equity issue is really that life cycle. So I had the same experience. I volunteered at our local clinic right around December and January. We had the same thing, like people who could come in at first were really the well-connected, and it took some time. And I was in North Carolina. We did it better later. They set up the same things, and they went through the same sort of steps to try to figure out how to go to the neighborhoods and all those things. But to understand another aspect of it, I think vaccine hesitancy is also part of inequity. And to understand this, just sort of stop and go back to October, September of 2020, check the news. When the news came that we were likely going to have trial readouts as early as October, November, there was a massive freak out, to put it politely, among liberals and Democrats that Trump was pressuring the FDA to do something unsafe. And I can find you lots of examples of people who are currently very, like, they're not anti-vaccine. They were saying, I'm not taking this. I don't trust this, because they thought Trump would be forcing FDA to take a shortcut. So the people who now are like, they're all currently very pro-vaccine, but just 9 months ago, 10 months ago, they were like, I'm not taking this one, because they did not trust the institution. Now imagine 30, 40, 50 years of that institution treating you badly, right? We had one Trump presidency and lots of liberals were willing to say, I'm not taking this vaccine. They didn't even trust the FDA's independence under one president. Our FDA is a lot more independent compared to a lot of other countries. Now, in a country like, say, the South Africa, where there is now high levels of hesitancy, I just wrote a piece about this. It starts with, well, we had the HIV drugs, which unlike vaccines were really easy to sort of up the supply because they're drugs. Vaccines are harder to manufacture. And when they wanted to import generic versions, 39 major pharmaceutical companies went to court in South Africa to try to stop the South African government from importing generic drugs that were available. And millions of people died in the whole process. Like this is the HIV/AIDS crisis. Moderna carried out some of its trials, a lot of its trials in South Africa, along with J&J, because South Africa, because of the HIV crisis, partly has a really good infrastructure for public health and carrying out clinical trials. Moderna did not give any vaccines to South Africa or anywhere till much later and until after a lot of shaming, even though you'd carried out trials there. Same thing with J&J, they shipped it out. So when you look at that 30-year, 40-year, hundreds of years of history, and again, just sort of, if you think you're immune to this, just go back to October of 2020, where a lot of people, medical doctors, high-level people who ended up in the Biden task force were saying, I don't trust this vaccine, even though there was nothing. So trust is so crucial. So this is the thing, when vaccine hesitancy, there's a lot of this, oh, they're just being stupid, rather than understanding somebody's asking you to put something in your body. If you do not trust that institution, if that institution has mistreated you, it's a very normal human reaction to say, what on earth is going on? That trust has to be earned over time. It can't just be like, here's the moment, there you go, do it or not. And if not, you're anti-science. That's just too simplistic a view of how this works.
I think that point is very apt because
I just have these.
I just turned it on. I'm just doing it in case we have a Zoom.
It's okay. We are on Zoom, but
That's fine.
I think but there is a mic that's hopefully counting us.
Because of the recent editorials about South Africa and they're turning down vaccines. And that's really not true. And I think people need to reflect back on the experience in the United States of how long it took before certain populations really bought into being vaccinated. And I think some of that comes with, there are long-standing health inequities in the United States. And there are also longer standing global health inequities that we have played a part in. And so I think for us to not understand that lens and just to say like, well, we donate these vaccines, people should just be grateful and take them. That's misunderstanding how complex the issue actually is. And so I think what people are doing now is trying to play catch up. And I think things like the Omicron variant are pushing people to try to play catch up faster. But I think it just underscores how important it is that we rethink the entire system. We have set up a system to fail 100% because you get the outcome that you design. And in this case, we have gotten exactly the outcome that we have designed to get. We have unequal distribution across the world of vaccines. We do not have the infrastructure across the world to be able to produce adequate vaccine in other continents. And so now we have to push to be able to do that for the second pandemic that we have. So I think, this has to be, for me, a moment in time when people say, how do we prevent this from it? The current coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic, the ability to build infrastructure to be able to produce new vaccine is not going to tackle the current pandemic. That is for future pandemics. And so I think we have an opportunity to say, how do we redesign a system? And I'm sure someone will ask about intellectual property rights, and I'm sure that's coming. How do we redesign a system that is agile, that is nimble, that is able to support mass vaccination or mass distribution of drugs, because it doesn't always have to be vaccines, drugs, at a global scale, because that's the only thing that will have a meaningful impact on a pandemic that is, by definition, is a pandemic. So I think the ideal idea of a nationalistic view, that just has to be thrown out, because we do have a responsibility to our populace. Absolutely, I'm not saying we don't, but we also have a responsibility to, how do we really end this? How do we end COVID-19? It's not just by vaccinating the United States. The only way to end it in the United States is if you vaccinated the United States and closed our borders forever with zero travel. So that's the only way to actually have an end for one country. And that's not realistic, and that should not happen. So I think we have to play a part in how to fix this and how to really prepare for a future. Because we've definitely played a part in how unequal the system is across the world.
Yeah, so I think building on that, you said it yourself, health inequity is not new. It's existed for many, many generations, unfortunately. And so if we think about these historical structures and behaviors that have contributed to it, both from a domestic standpoint, because even within the US, it's problematic, and then globally, it's a totally different problem as well. So if we think about, we're speaking to kind of the Columbia Business School community, what are things that we can do as people within the broader business community, as being a premier business school with a focus in the healthcare sector, being part of Columbia University more broadly, what are things that we could potentially do to try to mitigate these inequities? We're not going to solve all the problems, but we can hopefully make progress. Maybe Zainab, if you want to start.
And let me start as a sort of bring in my previous life as a sort of somebody who criticized a lot about social media and technology, internet, digital media. And I thought, you know what, it's great. I love it. Like, I'm a geek person myself. That's my tribe. I like a lot of this, but just like big major historic transitions that are scientific, industrial, large in scope, we need some oversight. We need to think about the downside. So when I said stuff like that, my tech world friends were like, oh, the government's incompetent and this is terrible and they'll always screw it up. And they kind of dealt with it with a lot of revolving doors. Like, I don't know, so many Obama people went to Silicon Valley after the presidency, sometimes during, it was like this love affair, and they just would be hired back in FTC and back and forth. And we saw no meaningful regulation in that. Right? So the pandemic hits, and now all my tech friends are like, why isn't the government working well? I'm like, you can't have the part you don't like kneecapped and then hope the FDA works, right? This is the way a lot of the business community would like to kneecap the part that's regulating them, but then wants the rest of it to work. So somebody kneecaps the FDA. There's such a pharmaceutical company turnover, revolving doors there. It is just incredible. And it's very, I really think it should be reported on. We have a problem like the Boeing Max crisis is absolutely a crisis of corporate mismanagement and lack of oversight, both within the company and the FAA. And it's not an artificial intelligence anything. You can kind of trace it. It's a business story. The social media, digital information, privacy, it's a business story. So what happens is every little business sector has problems with their own regulatory apparatus. And then they respond by like further undermining it, which lets them get away with not having oversight, because the FTC can't even keep up with the lawsuits very often, doesn't have sort of the intellectual capacity and depth, and the lobbyists end up writing the rules. And then they complain, well, why isn't the other side of the government working? Why isn't the FDA working faster? Why isn't doing this? So I think for the business community, that's the kind of the thing. You can get away with undermining a certain regulatory structure to the advantage of your sector, but so is everybody else doing the same thing. And where we end up is a government that doesn't have the capacity to address what we need to address. When the time comes and when you need it, it's no longer there. And I think we saw this with, like in the beginning, the CDC tried to produce quickly some tests, and they didn't work. Like CDC couldn't produce functioning tests. And if you told me this before the pandemic, like my jaw would be on the floor. CDC is the premier public health institution in the world, so we thought. And then the FDA couldn't sort of get on the ball and try to figure out what alternative tests could work. So the United States spent months and months without functioning mass scale tests, and public health, like labs like Columbia's would be able to test, but FDA couldn't get on the ball and say, okay, fine, CDC tests aren't working, now you can go ahead. And there was just this incredible 2 months of incompetence that I never would have expected, to be honest, out of either the CDC or the FDA, two institutions that I think are essential and do a lot of great work, still do a lot of great work, but clearly they don't have the same capacity anymore. And when you look back at how we got there, it's decades of not just lack of funding, but also weakening them and making them less public health, more pharmaceutical company benefit oriented, especially with the FDA. You see this with the FTC, you see this with the FAA, you're seeing this with the EPA. So that's kind of my like business thing, is that the business government friction in the end ends up, what's the right word? In the end, ends up hollowing the capacity the businesses themselves need, because there's a reason we have all this. Like in the normal times, you don't see why we need it, but when you need it, you don't get to pull it out of a hat. Like if you have undermined it for decades, when you need it, it doesn't just come back like that. And I think the successful countries like South Korea, that's what they did after a MERS like close call. A government went down almost like over this. They mishandled it, and there was this inquiry, but they got ready for whatever could come next. And when they did get hit, and they had the same first case, same day as US did, January 20th, South Korea had its first case, known case. US had its first case. South Korea actually had it worse for a while because they had some super spreader events at churches. Year and a half later, I just checked because I was writing something about it. They have a total of 3,500 deaths in a country of 50 million. That's like 1 week in New York in April 2020. That's their total toll. There's nothing magic about this. They were ready. They had mass testing ready. Like while we were still struggling with, CDC's test not functioning, their CDC had called in all the manufacturers and said, we're going to do this and you're going to get regulatory approval. They were like on the ball right there, stomped out the outbreak. So you can kind of see what a functioning government, at least in this case, looks like. And I would like to just add one thing. Sometimes we get this, I did a lot of research in Hong Kong right before I came to the pandemic because I study movements and things. I see a lot of ideas that they're successful because they're more obedient and we're more individual. And I would like to remind people, South Koreans through protests put a corrupt government as president in jail. Something I have not seen. Like it wasn't like they're not more obedient in some particular way. And Hong Kong spent the last 2 years essentially in this massive uprising. It's not some sort of, there's no South Asian obedience that you can explain. If anything, we've never, I don't think US has ever put a corrupt president in jail or anything like that. So that doesn't really explain. I think the real answer is state capacity, along with a population that trusted that state capacity, is a much better explanation of how things went better in places that went better like that, compared to here where we had the money and the wealth and the supply and some of the best universities in the world and all of that, and top-notch pharmaceutical companies. And yet we have some of the highest death rates in the world. So
I fully agree with you. I think and I will answer the original question, which was what can people do? But I think there's so much to unpack in not only why the response in the United States should have been better. I think some of it is, I think you're correct, that some of it is undermining of our federal agencies. I could not agree more. The FDA and the CDC are absolutely essential to the functioning of the United. They are absolutely essential. But I think it's probably even more than that. I think some of it goes back to, again, that nationalistic view that things happen over there and that they won't really come on our shores. And because we should have learned from MERS, from SARS, from Ebola. We had Ebola sort of as this, perhaps we were going to see some Ebola cases in New York City, and there was 1 or 2, and we prepped, everyone was ready. And if we had had the same experience if COVID had been as deadly as Ebola, we would be our numbers are frighteningly high now. And I think people don't even conceptualize how high they are anymore. It's like 780,000 Americans have died since the beginning of COVID. Like that's nearly 1 million people. I don't think people recognize how high that number is. But we could have known, and in fact, we did know that this would come. And we not only did we undermine, but we didn't prepare. And I think that's where I think going back to, you design the system for the outcome it produces. And so we have designed this system to produce the outcome it has produced. And I think some of this was played out in state versus state. So, you know, in the midst of March and April of last year, of this year, I don't even remember anymore. I guess it was last year, when people are clamoring for ventilators. And it's literally states vying for ventilators from the federal government versus other states. So instead of thinking again of how do we look at this as a country, or how do we look at this as a globe, how do we understand how to prevent this for the future, instead it was, and I'm not going to knock capitalism, but I think there's an underscore of a lot of this vying for yourself to try to fix the system that is not, and I'm not going to get into any politics, it's not what I'm here for, but I do believe that government systems have to be in place. You must have a social and healthcare safety net. And at some point we can come back and talk about universal healthcare coverage, which again is part of why in the United States we saw such tragic numbers that we've seen. But I think in terms of what can you do on an individual level, I think, honestly, I think people need to read more. I think I do. And I say that, I don't say that tongue in cheek. I say that in all honesty. People need to understand the history. People need to understand why is it that, you know, people were more hesitant to be vaccinated in the beginning. What are social determinants of health? Why do people talk about systemic racism and the structures and the systems that have been created because of it? Because what we're seeing that's happening right now with closing the borders, again, there is a lot of overtones of racism in what we're talking about now. And there's a lot of leaving behind an entire continent of 1.3 billion people that don't even have representation in the G20. Like, I mean, there are systems at play here that we need to understand what is the undercurrent of this. And so I think people really do need to read more, because people think that things happen to them, or things have happened to this society, or things are out of your control, and they're not. I think if you understand what are the motivations, what system are we designing? Is this a system for equity or not? Then we will have the outcomes that we say that we idealize this country, and we say that we have this ability for everyone to obtain their optimal health, but we don't. So I think reading more, understanding what the history of the country is, understanding the history of the systems that we have put in place, and then in whatever field you end up in whatever company you end up in, really thinking about, am I designing this system with equity in mind? And am I designing the system to support the outcome that I want to achieve? Because again, I will say, I'm like a broken record with this system will produce the outcome that it is designed to produce, unless you actively work to create a system that produces a different outcome. So I think for me, I tell a lot of people read more, but there's never too much to read. There's not. I have a book list that's about 50 books deep right now. I'm reading The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Very interesting. You should read that. I also, in my bag, I have sort of the history of the Great Migration. People need to read and understand why things are the way they are. But I think and I just want to make sure we talk on this point, because I think then there's sort of the bigger question, because I know people have asked this. So getting back to that first idea of, well, how do we fix it now? So right now we're worried about Omicron coming from South Africa, which it's all over Europe. So I mean, at this point, it just hasn't been detected. But there's no way that if you look at the map, it's in Belgium and it's in like Portugal, but it's not in France. Like, okay, that's just because it hasn't been. I mean, come on, like the viruses don't behave that way. It's like, oh, we're gonna not go to this one country. It's there. It just hasn't necessarily been detected. So I think, like, how do we fix this current system? And how do we take it out of because there's been a lot of questions about the ethics of boosters and the ethics of how we disseminated vaccine. I think we're beyond that question at this point. There's enough vaccine in the United States for anybody that wants them like twice over. So the ethics of boosters we're beyond that at this point. You can get a booster in the United States. The vaccine is available to you. What we need to do now is understand the rest of the vaccines that are available, because there are millions and millions of doses out there that are not being distributed in the way that they need to get to people. So the United States has pledged about 1 billion doses. I think they've given out maybe about 200 million or something like that. And they're currently in a little bit of a disagreement with Moderna, because although Dr. Corbett was like held up at, and she's phenomenal, Moderna was very happy to talk about her inclusion in the creation of their mRNA vaccine. They're trying to exclude the 3 NIH-funded scientists from their patent application. And the reason that's important is that if the United States can get on the patent application for the Moderna vaccine, they can actually have some say in how it's disseminated and how they actually produce the vaccine. So they're in a bit of a fight right now. And if you're interested in that, you should watch, there's about a 2-hour, it's a COVID-19 committee from the US government. They just met maybe 2 weeks ago, and they talked all about the US's response to COVID-19 vaccine equity. It's available on the government's website. And David Kessler talks all about what our response should and could and will be to improve vaccine equity. So one is thinking about our distribution systems now. So how do we take the vaccine that we have available and get it into the arms of people? That is a more complex question, a complex answer, because it's not just making sure that you have someone who can put the vaccine in the arm. For Moderna and Pfizer, it's all the cold chain that has to be maintained through distribution of the vaccine. It's making sure that we're not just giving 1 dose, but now we're coming back and giving a second, and we're available to give a booster. It's making sure that we have all of that in place. And again, I could harp on the fact that we should have done this a long time ago, but we didn't. We're here where we are now. So how do we fix it? Well, we put the money behind it. So these are solvable problems. When people tell me about cold chain issues, okay. Well, when we learned at New York Presbyterian, when we learned that we had to store these, and at that time it was super cold chain, guess what we did? We bought a lot of industrial freezers. So why can't we do that now? Well, when we figured out that we had to get more people to vaccinate, we rethought about what our sort of redeployment strategies were. When we realized that it was time critical and we had to get it done, we figured out how to do it. So again, these were solvable problems. We have to figure out the cold chain. We have to figure out distribution strategies, and we have to really force Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson to give the vaccines. Because if you look at the discrepancy right now, and I think that the WHO has said that they want everyone to be, I think by fall of 2022, they want every country to have hit like 70% vaccination. That is impossible at current trends, impossible. Countries in Africa would have to increase their vaccine distribution and vaccine administration by 20 times what it is right now to be able to meet that. 20 times.
They'll be infected before that.
Yeah, well, I mean, with who knows what variant though.
Yeah.
So I think there's figuring out how, like, this is a problem of time and money. And because we have the supply of the vaccine available, we need to figure out how to get it to the people that need it the most. And I actually think that the conversation around intellectual property rights and whether or not Moderna and Pfizer should give up their IP to be able to make generic versions of the vaccine, I think honestly that it'll be filibustered long enough that it won't matter, because we'll have to change the components to be able to tackle the new variant that's coming. I do think the conversation around intellectual property when it comes to the antivirals is probably a more interesting conversation, because those are easily disseminated, can definitely improve mortality, and those are a pill. So you could just blanket an entire country with antivirals. So I do think that question is going to come up. And I honestly, my prediction is that if there is another wave of a variant that's not covered, and there's a concern about intellectual property rights, the worst thing that could happen to a lot of these companies is that the US government overrides it. And I think right now we're in a sort of country lull. The vaccine, the numbers are slightly creeping up, but our vaccination rates are going up. If we were in this same place we were in April of 2020, I think Moderna and Pfizer would be in a very sticky position in terms of their IP, because there's a certain point at which you would say it's not in the best interest of the world for you to maintain this. And I think the problem is that one company cannot do it on its own. Moderna cannot supply enough vaccine for the world. Pfizer cannot supply enough vaccine for the world. They don't have the distribution strategies. They don't have the people on the ground. But guess who does? Governments. So I think we have to rethink how government works with these large companies. I think we do have to rethink how IP works in the setting of pandemic. And I know that's going to get a ton of pushback by the US government. So, but I ultimately think that we have an opportunity to figure out in real time how to get the vaccine that we have available into people's arms. We have millions of doses that have not left the US shores. And then I think we have an opportunity to redesign a system so that it doesn't produce this outcome again.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have put any in the chat, I'm going to have Bianca call on you. If you're in the classroom, you're welcome to raise your hand.
I volunteered at a couple of vaccination events this summer outside Trenton, and a lot of the people who were coming were like these communities that have never had public health handed to them. And in talking to them about their vaccine options, a couple of them were like, I'm actually not interested in the vaccine, but I appreciate that you're here. So to what extent do you think the relative focus on health equities and vaccine equities in the pandemic will have lasting effects on broader health equities in the US? Do you think that we have helped that cause in terms of the response or hurt it in a way?
I think we have shed light on existent inequities in a way that we haven't in quite some time or ever. I think that you can't turn a page now without looking at maternal mortality rates in the United States, maternal mortality rates in New York City, the effects of chronic kidney disease and disproportionate effects of chronic kidney disease on different racial and ethnic groups, on the effects of lack of access to the financial system to be able to develop wealth in this country. So I think that there is a lot of conversation. I think that there are a fair number of large, so academic healthcare setups I take out of the equation, because I think when I say large companies and things like Goldman Sachs that donated, I don't know, it's $1 billion or something, or $10 billion, I don't remember, some astronomical sum, to elevate Black women. And so I think the conversation has started. I think that we have the opportunity to take what we've learned and do something different with it. And whether or not we're able to do that, I don't know yet. Because I think if you really get at what the heart of these problems, where does it lie? I mean, the easiest answer for me and what I come back to in all the talks that I give is the undercurrent in the United States for systemic inequity is systemic racism. And unless we really get at the fact that the structure that we have set up in the United States is focused on maintaining a system of unequal access and care, then we can't move forward. So I think I worry that this is a great conversation, that we're doing the right things, that we're thinking about the right questions. But when we really have to put rubber to the road and say, well, we have to change this, then I worry we're going to have a little bit of pushback. So I don't think we've heard it. I think things are slightly better. I'll couch because some things are a little worse, but I think some things overall are better.
Yeah, so Peter Tolman.
Peter, you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, first of all, let me just say that I thought it was a terrific discussion, and you guys are very important voices in this. So thank you for participating in this forum. I put a question in the chat, which seems to have disappeared from my computer, but it was essentially to say the following. You know, if you look in, you know, and related to Omicron specifically, you know, South Africa, which is my country of birth, really behaved impeccably in the identification of the variant, and in contrast to many other more powerful countries that came before them, like China, for example, but even India, and has been, you know, punished. Yeah, it's hard to use a different word other than punished for that. And I just wonder, you know, together with this latest example, together with some of the examples that you've given, what do you think the prospects are for increased equity? And particularly given some of the deep root causes that you've spoken about. And also, do you have thoughts on what we as a Columbia University community can or ought to be doing about it?
And if you want to start?
Yeah, so I think the Omicron example is really good example because like I'm for smart targeted travel restrictions to buy time, but you can't like ban by passport and then just sort of ignore the fact that it's everywhere else. Like I think so sort of a precautionary approach and saying, oh, there's a new variant. A reasonable thing would be we're going to increase the number of tests that travelers are subject to, and we're going to sequence more to try to catch the outbreak, rather than what we've got is the one country that behaved exemplary. Like they raised the alarm earlier than anybody else, exactly because they have that health infrastructure, ended up getting a blanket ban, decimating its industry. And it wasn't even accompanied by, well, we have to do this, we're very sorry, here's like a couple $2 billion till next week, well, and then we'll like figure it out. I mean, at a minimum, even if you were going to defend it, at a minimum, it would come along with an enormous gratitude, which to me means a check, because, you know, thanking them as President Biden did and then not announcing a thing, to me is just punitive and terrible and horrible. And of course, as you're saying, we're going to quickly discover that South Africa was the first place to detect and raise the alarm rather than the only place to have this thing. And the 7 other countries, they just seem to be coming along for the ride. Like there's, you know, Botswana did amazing too. They also saying, so I just can't imagine a worse move 2 years into a pandemic. And I have to say, you know, when Trump did this, it was pandemic theatrics. When President Biden does it, it's also pandemic theatrics, because this is not how you do travel restrictions, which can have a place within a comprehensive and temporary framework till you kind of figure things out in a couple of days or a week or whatever like that. There's not even a timeline for when they're going to apologize and lift this, right? It may just get stuck and decimate the thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think in terms of like the Columbia Business School or other things is that there's certain things that markets are good at, but even there, very often markets need prodding. Like that's why we have antitrust rules and regulations, because markets without any oversight tend to produce anti-competitive outcomes because of just the nature of how things operate at the institutional level. So even markets need non-market interventions to keep them competitive. We know this historically, but there's other things that markets aren't very good at because of the nature of the problem. Things that are public goods are usually not very amenable to market solutions. I say this as someone like who is quite sympathetic to market solutions to lots of things, because stagnation is a problem. I've sort of seen it in where I grew up, but on the other hand, you have to recognize where that's not the approach you can take. And healthcare tends to be one of those things where there's so much both public goods and infectious diseases, meaning the benefit or the harm is not, which is what you keep saying, it's not just you. There is no way to reward the virtuous and punish the non-virtuous if that's what people are imagining. Plus, that's not even how it works, because viruses don't check your virtue. They just infect you. They're looking for human cells, not passports or skin color or any of that. They're like, oh, ACE2 receptor. And like, that's all you got. So there's a way in which you have to complement whatever competitive things you're going to have with non-market things. To go back to the IP thing, which I think is very interesting, I think with drugs, like it's much of a no-brainer to me where we need to scale it up and it's easier. With vaccines, I'm even further. I think like just Moderna or Pfizer releasing the IP wouldn't solve the problem because vaccine production is hard. And like at the beginning, Pfizer genuinely, like they bought every damn vat, I'm sorry for language, vat or whatever they could find. What you needed was for the government to come in and say, hello, Merck, your vaccine failed. You're now a temporary subsidiary of this consortium. And I don't even care if they pay him $1 trillion at this point. I mean, at that point, economic damage from lack of vaccines is so huge that, I mean, I have ethical problems with inequality and too many billionaires and all of that. But at that point, I'm kind of like, I don't care, get the lifeboats. If you need to pay them, right? So we needed to get spare capacity in other companies converted to this kind of ramp up, which would have taken probably 6 to 8 months, because you can't just say, here's the IP, here's a country that's never done it, because vaccines are tricky. It's not like drugs. You can't just do generic ones like that. And that would have required leadership. And I feel like we could have done it by, if necessary, paying. Not the ideal, but if necessary, by paying, and the economic benefit would have been enormous. And I think we're going to run into this. Yes, we're going to have an Omicron specific variant vaccine working in 6 weeks. We're going to have it, but having one isn't what you want. You want 6 billion.
Yeah.
It's the same question. How are you going to get 6 billion as soon as possible? There is no way, even with the enormous capacity they've developed. And I believe it, they're working around the clock. Pfizer and Moderna cannot supply that rapidly. Whatever other capacity is out there in private companies, in government, in other places, needs to be coordinated with some government leadership and under some sort of economic framework that the details I think we can figure out as we go along. Only that doesn't make sense. Otherwise, we're going to have the same thing. There's going to be 300 million doses. Half of them will be here, half of them will be in Europe, and then the same trickle down will be, and then potentially we'll go through the Greek alphabet and some other alphabets and various other things and start learning Klingon, because then you don't like end up. This is just not a sane way to deal with a pandemic. And it's not even a cost-effective way to deal with a pandemic. So, sorry, you
No, I completely agree with you absolutely agree with you, because they both, I know Pfizer and Moderna have both agreed to put on-site manufacturing capabilities in the continent of Africa. They haven't said where yet, but it likely will be South Africa, is my guess, in 2022. That will be ready to produce vaccines in like 2 years. Yeah. I mean, these are not things that you can do overnight. So even if Pfizer gave everyone the IP and Moderna gave everyone the IP, it's sourcing the raw materials, which were in short supply for a period of time there as well. Like Pfizer couldn't get some of the, there's like a liposaccharide like sort of sack it's in, couldn't get that. So it's also like, where do the raw materials come from? How do you then put it together? And so that's why I'm more interested in some of the antivirals, because, and I think Pfizer is actually in an agreement already.
So I think Pfizer knows what's coming.
Because so Pfizer had the experience.
Yeah, they immediately were like, okay, we're going to have lower fee access to lower middle income countries. And I'm kind of like, that's fine, but it can't just be whatever they say. It has to be where they, because it has to also be supply, because just saying we're going to give it to you cheaper, but oh, wait a minute, we have no supply. It's kind of like when you have a sale, like you click on it and the only one available is for people like, you know, twice as tall as me. And like, I am kind of like, that's not a sale. Like I need one in my size, and there's none in any sort of average sizes. They're just one that's like some sort of thing. So you can't let that be. And with the sort of vaccine production, at some point, Moderna's nanolipids, which are really good, but proprietary, but there's a lot of craft to this thing. There's a couple hundred people. It was a bottleneck. And I'm like, I appreciate it. Like you can't just sort of turn it over, but that means you know, April 2022, you start saying, all right, you 100 people, you're going to start training the next 1,000, so that you can 6 months later have that, because vaccine production when J&J tried to use some US subcontractors,
Yeah.
they kept screwing it up. It is not straightforward with pills. We know from HIV that IP sharing can really be useful, which hopefully will be with vaccines. You needed cooperation and training and building of capacity, which needs
It's years.
leadership. Yeah, years.
Thank you. We have
Granted.
Going
we
on.
have run out of time. We could probably talk for a lot longer. There's a lot of issues and things to discuss. But I just want to thank you, Julie and Zainab, for
Thank
taking
you
the
for
time
inviting
to
us.
join us
For having
today.
us.
Thank you for everybody for joining us as well. For the MBA students, you can now log on to campus groups for the PBI event questionnaire. And thank you everyone for being here and look forward to seeing you at more HPM events in the future. Thank you, everyone.